Chapter 22. Joyce couldn't believe what she was seeing when Kent tossed those two double doors open. She had expected to see a wide open area with the deck and her shuttle sitting there. Instead, what she saw looked like an anthill of bugs, damn near blocking any vision of the shuttle at all. The smell of rot had swept in over them. In the first few seconds of the fight, she and the rest had taken out a good 24 of the closest, and now had cleared every bug out to 50 meters. She'd used 6 full magazines, and the Kramer was starting to heat up in her hands. Kent and his 3 men had gone out and left, checking the wall above them first. Then Hank and his 3 had gone out and gone right along the wall, doing the same. That spread out their firing angles and gave them a larger killing area. She was kneeling beside the door on the right, carefully taking aim and killing any bug that even pretended to move. The rest of the group had spread around the door and were doing the same. It was now starting to feel to her like a target practice session, as they all knocked legs and heads off anything out in that open hangar. She desperately wanted to get across that killing field of alien bodies and acid blood, but for the moment it felt much safer right where they were, their backs to the wall, killing anything that moved in front of them. Then, through the almost deafening bursts of gunfire around her, she heard her name being shouted.
"Captain Palmer! Captain Palmer!"
She stood and looked in both directions down the line. Hank and a few others had heard the call also and had stopped firing. He indicated that the voice had come from the right, closer to the main entrance and above him. She stepped out and looked up at the balcony that ran along there. It was dark and she couldn't see a thing. "Cease fire!" she shouted. "Cease fire unless one moves right at you!" The firing stopped, and the last of the roaring sound echoed over the dead aliens and the hangar deck.
"Captain Palmer!"
"Right here!" she shouted back.
"Sergeant Green, up here!"
"Glad to hear your voice, Sergeant," Joyce shouted back. The relief of having the Marines with them again was almost as much as she had felt when they first showed up in the tunnels.
"You need to get back to your ship as soon as you can,"
Green called back. To her left, a Kramer opened up, and across the deck an alien head exploded like a cherry bomb going off. She waited until the echo died off in the huge chamber, then shouted back.
"We were headed that way." "I know,"
Green said.
"But a pitched fight like this will only draw more of the bugs to this area. There's lots more of them than you have bullets to kill. Trust me."
"What should we do?" Joyce shouted back, feeling relieved she had someone else to make the decisions for a moment.
"Fan out in small groups,"
Green shouted.
"Then fight your way to the ship. We'll cover you from here."
"Will do," she said. "Back to Plan A," she shouted at Kent and Deegan to her left. "Let's move. Hank, you ready?" "Right with you," he said. She motioned for the men around her to follow her, pointing to 3 of the men near her. "You watch our asses. Don't let one of those sons of bitches in behind us. Understood?" All 3 nodded. She clicked a fresh magazine into her Kramer and took a deep breath. Then started off slowly towards her shuttle, across the field of dead bugs and acid blood. All around her, Kramers screamed and bugs died. From the balcony behind her, Kramers cut the air, blowing aliens away at incredible distances across the huge hangar. Those Marines were great shots, of that there was little doubt. She caught a glimpse of one of the downed aliens in front of her twitching, and she blew its head apart like a melon hitting a wall. Another bug crawled up on her ship over the hatch they were headed for, and she and two others beside her sent it spinning off the other side in an acid spray. Joyce hoped like hell that acid didn't get into any important mechanisms on the outside of the shuttle. She didn't think it would, but anything was possible. On her left, the sounds of firing were continuous. She glanced over, and Deegan's group was in a position approaching the nose of the shuttle. They were firing more often than any other group, keeping the bugs away from the ship and watching their open left side. 20 meters closer to her, Kent and his group paralleled her, mostly helping Deegan's group keep the left clear. 20 meters to her right, Hank and his crew, supported by help from Sergeant Green above and behind them, had very little to do. She made the ramp and stationed 2 men at the bottom and 2 others to watch the top of the ship above her. She scrambled up the ramp and was damn glad to see the door had been sealed. She let out a deep sigh and started the opening cycle. At least inside would be bug-free. She got the door open and then turned back to check on everybody's position. Deegan and his men were posted around the nose of the shuttle, watching both sides of the ship. Hank and his men were doing exactly the same around the tail and thruster section. The rest had taken up positions around the ship, killing any bug that moved anywhere, sometimes 2 or 3 men taking it out with long-distance shooting.
"Sergeant!"
Joyce shouted.
"Join us! We'll cover you!" "On our way!"
Green's voice echoed over the chamber. "Hurry, goddammit," she said under her breath. "Hurry." She had a sinking feeling that everything was about to go very wrong. She didn't know why. Everyone was in place and no bug was getting within 50 meters of the ship, but it still felt wrong, like it had been too easy. And Green's words echoed in her head about not having more ammunition than bugs. She still had 2 belts left. The 5 Marines were down the stairs from the balcony and spread out in an arrow formation, with Green in the center, jogging across the floor through the dead bugs, when things changed. And changed quick.
"Bugs! Through the storage area!"
Kent shouted as the door to the labs smashed inward with a huge crash, and a wave of black, ugly aliens swarmed through the brightly lit storage room. Kent and some of the men around him, who had the best shots straight into the room, opened fire, cutting some of the bugs down under the bright lights before they could even get to the hangar doors. But there were so many more bugs behind them. They just kept coming, climbing right over the bodies of their dead like they weren't even there.
"Green! Behind you!"
Hank shouted. The entrance to the decontamination chamber was suddenly filled with bugs, swarming through like a dam had just broken. Green and his men, still only halfway to the ship, spread out and took up positions, their guns screaming, filling the entrance and the decontamination chamber with dead aliens. But the flow of bugs continued, through both doors and from the overhead balcony, where the sergeant and his men had been just a few moments before. And from the shadows of the far side of the hangar. Magazine after magazine, she cut down bugs, reloaded, cut down more, reloaded, cut down more, and they just kept coming, and coming. The Kramer felt like a hot pan in her hands, but still she held on. She didn't have time to let it cool. Her ears were ringing. The grey smoke from the guns half blinded her.
"Grenades!"
Green shouted, and almost as one, 5 headed for the main entrance. To her right, she saw Kent and 3 of his men do the same at the entrance from the supply area. The concussion from the grenades sent alien limbs, heads and bodies everywhere, and shook rocks from the roof of the hangar deck. But the bugs just kept coming. Climbing over hundreds of their own dead, they poured into the room.
Fall back!
Green shouted to his men, and they started moving, firing as they went.
Give them cover!
Joyce shouted, and she and her crew did the best they could to keep the bugs back. But it was clear that Green and his men weren't going to make it. Green had been right. There were just too many of them. But she kept firing anyway. The Queen bit almost completely through the neck of the rogue, and the Professor's pride, his creation, his lifetime of work, lay on the floor twitching like so much raw meat. The Queen bent over her victim, grabbed the rogue's remaining arm, and yanked it off, throwing it against the wall as if disgusted. The Professor was livid. Behind him, the remains of Grace were splattered along the wall. He bent and picked up her Kramer, then cocked the sound cannon.
You're dead, you bitch!
With the Kramer in his left hand, he punched the on button for the sound cannon and set it to high. So high, it could kill any alien within 200 meters by itself. So high that she wouldn't know what had hit her. The room seemed to shimmer, and the Queen reared up, seeming to scream, her hands at her head.
Don't like that, do you, you bitch?
He shouted, firing at her with the Kramer in his left hand, stepping closer and closer. Her tail smashed the remains of the rogue behind her, and she turned away from the sting of the bullets, still screaming her silent scream. He pumped bullets at her and stepped closer. As she swung around, away from his painful attack, her razor-sharp tail went up and then down at the Professor. Her aim was perfect and lightning fast. He saw it coming, but didn't have time to move even a fraction of a meter. The impact knocked him sideways and sent him spinning across the floor to the left. The pain in his side and arm didn't seem real, it was so sharp. He could feel his blood pumping into the air. His right arm, cut off cleanly at the shoulder, with the sound cannon still gripped tightly in his right hand, flew through the air and landed near Grace. It bounced once, but the impact served to jar the finger even more into the trigger. The Professor screamed and tried to stop the blood flowing from the hole in his shoulder. The Queen screamed and tumbled sideways, her legs and tail smashing what was left of the rogue. Beside Grace, the sound cannon, with the Professor's arm still attached, started beeping. Slow at first, but then faster and faster. Through gritted teeth, the Professor laughed.
It's going critical, you bitch! You're going to die for what you did!
Beep, beep, beep. The Queen continued thrashing. Beep, 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 beep.
Oh, does that hurt, my dear?
The Professor cried. He tried to sit up, but couldn't.
I sure hope so.
The beeping of the gun turned into a long, continuous, high-pitched wail as the sound cannon went critical.
I'll see you in hell, bitch!
The intense white flash ended his insanity and her pain.